So what is the goal? What is the goal at church? For people to behave, sit still, and be quiet? No, of course not. We want to move people closer to Jesus. We want to introduce people to Jesus. We want people to learn the Bible and the gospel. And how do we do that? There's so many different variables to consider and so many different barriers that can get in the way. It's kind of like fishing. We have all these different variables. We have tackle, bait, lures, rods, reels, variabilities like water depth, temperature, the weather, the depth of the water, the clarity of the water. When we're fishing, we have to have the right conditions. Everything has to be just right. And we get our line out in the water, we have everything set, and we catch a big one. And then we're trying to reel them in slowly and carefully so we don't lose that fish that's on the line. And it's the same thing when we're fishing for people. Jesus told us to be fishers of men. And we finally have someone coming to Jesus and moving closer. But some people are really far away. It's kind of like ocean fishing, and they're way out there. And you have to have a really heavy line, and you have to reel it in for a long time. And there's lots of barriers in our way. The ocean waves and other fish that might actually, a shark might take off half the fish before you can even get it there. There's so many different variables and barriers to consider. And when we're fishers of men, it's the same thing. We have to consider what our bait is, what are people's interests, what are our different variables, what are our different barriers that might actually get in the way of someone coming closer and knowing Jesus. Some people are very far from him. Maybe they've never heard about Jesus, or maybe they've heard about him, but they haven't heard nice things. Or maybe a person with a disability actually feels hurt by God. All these things can be barriers. Other people might be closer to him already, but we're still working on removing those barriers, getting them out of the way so that people can continue to come closer and closer to Jesus. And we can't save people. Only the Holy Spirit and only God can do that. But we can remove the barriers. We can intentionally design our environment so that we're including everyone and considering all their interests and their weaknesses and their strengths and their needs. But if there's barriers in the way, we've got to remove them. It's so important that we consider what are the barriers. People come into our churches, but often there are barriers to their learning once they're there. So I brought in my KerPlunk game today, and you can see the congregation up here gathered, ready to learn. But then you can also see we have lots of different barriers in the way. We're trying to get them down here to the narrow gate. Matthew 7:13 through 14 talks about narrow gate. It says, "Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." But I am hoping today that our entire congregation gathered up here is going to find their way to the narrow gate. So we have all these people ready to learn about Jesus, hear the gospel, study the Bible. But then what if there are barriers? What if a person has, for example, restricted interests? And a lot of people that have autism spectrum disorder have restricted interests, meaning they are really just interested in the things that they are interested in. So what is a way that we can remove that barrier? One way we can remove this barrier is to use their interests to teach. For example, I have a student who loves dinosaurs, but the Bible talks about dinosaurs. There's lots of cool verses about dinosaurs in Job, and we can learn about creation, and that creation involved dinosaurs. God created dinosaurs. So there's lots of ways that we can use specific interests and restricted interests to teach the Bible and the gospel. Another barrier barrier can be cognition, but let's think about what are some ways we could remove that barrier. Can we provide multiple means of learning, which is exactly what universal design for learning is, providing multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression, giving them lots of different ways to learn. How about ADHD? Sometimes ADHD can cause lots of barriers for a person for learning, but we might try things like alternative seating. Do we have to have people sitting to be able to learn? Actually, no. Most people learn better when they're not sitting for too long. So we might provide things like this in the back, tables where they could stand and be in the back to learn, or maybe a wiggle seat. I actually have an entire video series about sensory tools that we can use to help engage people in learning and help them to stay seated when they have trouble focusing and paying attention. That's on our website, overcomerministries.com, so you might want to check that out. Another thing is social expectations. I think this is a barrier we don't think about enough. Social expectations can really cause a lot of issues for people at church. It can prevent people from coming to church. If people get shh at church or looked at in a funny way, that can cause people not to want to come to our churches. So I think the best way to remove that barrier is to have realistic expectations and to realize that we are all different and we all have different needs. And we can all learn together if we actually have realistic expectations and we allow kids to move and wiggle and be a little noisy, and people that have exuberance in their worship and actually make noise and not worry about that. Another one can be communication. Communication can be a real barrier. And something that we can use for communication difficulties is visual icons. We see icons all around on our phones, our computers, and signs, but visual icons can be super helpful for people that have communication issues. How about transitions? Transitions can be a tricky thing. How about if someone gets dysregulated every time there's a transition that's new? So sometimes it helps for people to have a visual schedule, and that's pictures or even a list, if they read, of the schedule so that they know what's coming up and can prepare themselves to get ready for that transition. These are simple tools that can be a huge help for people to be able to stay and learn. How about writing? Writing is a big one. We often require writing to learn in our churches and in our classes, but really, do we have to be able to write to learn? That's something we want to think about. And we can provide tools like voice to text. We have those on iPads and our phones, and we can add those apps to our computers. Another barrier could be anxiety. Lots of different things can cause anxiety. People have trauma. People may be nervous just to go to church because it's new. Lots of different diagnoses can cause anxiety. So we want to be really sensitive to anxiety and that it can be a real barrier for people learning at church. So one thing that can help people is to have a routine and know the routine ahead of time. We might even want to post things on our websites of churches like the schedules so people know what to expect, or a bulletin, or even just a slide at the beginning when people come into the service so they know what the routine of the congregation is or of the classroom. And that can really help relieve a lot of anxiety. Look at that. We have someone who went through the gate. So what about deafness? Have you considered having an ASL, American Sign Language interpreter, in your church? And sometimes we think, well, do we really need an interpreter? We don't have anyone that's deaf in our church. Well, maybe we don't have anyone that's deaf in our church because we don't have an American Sign Language interpreter. So that can really be a huge barrier for people that are deaf. This is a big one. And sometimes this one can be really hard. Behaviors that keep people from learning and can even disrupt people around them from learning. And that can be a big issue. But often behaviors can be caused by sensory issues. And not all behaviors are caused by sensory issues, but a lot of them have a sensory component to them. So I would really challenge our churches to learn how to be sensory friendly. And we can do that through group congregational training. And I also provide a video series on how to be sensory friendly in your church. That's also on my website, overcomerministries.com. What if we have another person through the narrow gate. What if we have someone that's hearing impaired? What if we could reserve them a seat up close to the interpreter or near the sound system so they can hear? An easy fix, but it makes a world of difference for a person who is hearing impaired. We have another one. What about executive function? People who have trouble organizing, planning, showing up, knowing when to show up. Can we provide them schedules and lists and calendars and different helps in order for them to be able to make it to church and be able to be included in all the different aspects of ministry? Here's one I really like to think about. Reading. Reading can be a big barrier. This can be a barrier for people who have not yet learned to read, or for people who have things like dyslexia or maybe a visual impairment. Can we provide things like text-to-speech? Those are so easy to provide now on apps, on our phones and computers, all the different ways that we can provide different digital helps for people who have difficulty with reading. Mobility. Woohoo! We have a bunch of people making it through the narrow gate. Mobility. Wow. This is one you'd think we would all think of, but it can be overlooked at times. Do we have good access to our churches, even just to get into the door? But then beyond that, is there access in our church onto the stage, into the different areas of ministry, into the different classrooms? Do people have ramps and elevators and railings that they need? How about a non-native speaker, someone who doesn't speak our language? Can we learn how to better help them by speaking slowly or providing different interpreters and helps? How about concrete thinking? Different diagnoses like autism can cause people to think more concrete and less abstract. They may have difficulty with things like idioms and jokes and slang. So can we be sensitive to that and avoid use of slang and idioms in our teaching? What about sensory processing? And we've already talked a little bit about sensory friendly and how to be sensory friendly in our church and ways we can learn about that. But even providing just basic sensory tools can be very helpful for people with sensory processing issues. And I really believe that we need to provide the basics like headphones and fidgets, a small weighted item, a wiggle seat, things like that in every church so people that have sensory issues can have the tools available to them. We also have training for all those different sensory tools and what we recommend on our website at overcomerministries.com. The assumptions of others. Wow, this is also another one I think is often overlooked. But what we assume can really hurt people. And so we really need education and awareness about different disabilities and different people's needs so that we have less assumptions of others and what they might need, of their strengths and weaknesses. And another thing is we can actually just ask people and listen and find out what they need and what their strengths and weaknesses are. And we can actually let them serve and use their gifts and strengths and help support them in their areas of weakness, just like all of us. Woohoo! Man, we got almost everybody down through the narrow gate. So this one is dyslexia. So a person who has dyslexia has difficulty with reading and learning. So can we provide multisensory learning? And we're going to be talking a lot about multisensory learning and how to do that. And that is a great way for everyone to learn. It's a very universal design for learning, way to learn, because it actually helps everyone to learn better. Language processing. This is how our brain actually processes what we're hearing and makes sense of it and uses it in a functional way. Sometimes it's helpful if we can speak slowly and clearly for people that have language processing issues. How about auditory processing? This is similar. This is how our brain also interprets what we are hearing through our ears. Sometimes captions can be really helpful for a lot of different people in our church, even people who do not recognize that they have a hearing impairment. Sometimes as we age, we don't really want to admit that we have a hearing or visual impairment. So some of these helps can actually even help people with hidden disabilities, those that people can't readily see or that people don't even recognize in themselves. Captions can be really great, and it's one of those things that is essential for some, but good for everyone. Writing, another one about writing. Can we have touch screens and keyboards, things like iPads and computers for people that struggle with writing? Comprehension, woohoo! We're getting everybody to Jesus today. We have, for comprehension, can we provide digital supports? Digital supports are wonderful. They have built-in vocabulary and definitions and pictures and videos, things that provide multiple ways for learning and comprehension, so that a person doesn't have to be singled out and ask questions all the time, but they can actually have a digital resource with them so that they can look up the definition or watch a quick video to be able to better understand what's going on. We have one more that's left behind. Let's see if we can get everybody to Jesus. So, visually impaired. So that can be a real barrier at times. And then again, it's one of those hidden disabilities that we often don't know that people have. Maybe they don't want to admit they have, or maybe they don't even want to admit to themselves that they have. So digital devices can be really helpful for people with a visual impairment as well. They can have built-in magnification, visual contrast, they can enlarge the font, they can change the colors of the backgrounds. There are so many different digital helps available with apps and computer programs where people can set their accessibility how they need to be able to better see what's on the screen. We have one more person that's trying to get to Jesus. Woohoo! Nonverbal. So sometimes people with autism spectrum disorder, developmental disabilities, and all kinds of different language issues, language impairments may be nonverbal. And a person who is nonverbal may need to use augmentative or alternative communication devices. We may not necessarily provide those as a church, but we can be friendly to those devices and learn how to use them and better understand people when they are communicating with us through their device. Well, we made it. Everybody has made it to the goal, which is making it to Jesus. And sometimes it's really easy to see all these barriers and get discouraged, and maybe even keep us from really focusing on the goal. I think about a little boy that I know who had a lot of really significant behavior issues. He was actually violent at some times. He would try to stomp on people's feet. He would try to pinch people, pull hair, or even throw chairs sometimes. And it was very easy, if we were not careful, to look at the behavior and focus on the behavior and forget about the goal of helping him to be able to learn about Jesus. But what we discovered is when we were actually focused on him and focused on his goal, trying to get him to Jesus, that we realized a lot of the things that were causing his behaviors were frustrations in him not being able to understand the lessons, and anxiety about being in the class, and other sensory processing issues. So when we started taking a look at how to get him to the goal and not focusing on the behavior, we were actually able to remove the barriers and change the structure of the class, provide resources, provide helps, and actually get him to the goal so that he was able to sit in class and participate with the other children. So I'd also like to talk about how Jesus removed barriers when he's teaching. Jesus believed that everyone can learn and that everyone could change. And this is something that neuroscience actually just discovered fairly recently. Before that, we didn't realize that people who've had strokes or cerebral palsy or different learning impairments could actually learn and continue to change their brain. But it's called neuroplasticity. Our brains are actually moldable. All through our life, we can change and mold our brains. We can actually have neurogenesis. And neurogenesis is like these neurons here. We can continue to grow neurons throughout our entire life. And these neurons can continue to grow and change and help us to learn. So our brains are plastic. Neuroplasticity, they are moldable and changeable. Everyone can learn and grow and learn about Jesus. Jesus engaged people and he made things relevant to their times and to their interests. He used all the different examples of the things around him when he was giving the parables and telling stories. Jesus encouraged persistence. Sometimes he let people struggle, didn't he? He let the disciples wonder what was going on and to process things and mull them over. Jesus cared for us emotionally, physically, as well as spiritually. He cared about our whole person, and he still does. And when we care about the whole person, we can learn much better. It takes our entire body to be able to learn well. If we're hungry or if we are in a dysregulated state, we cannot learn. And I really want people to think about that. If our sensory system is out of whack and we are dysregulated, if we're in fight or flight, people cannot learn. People who have anxiety, it really hinders their learning. So it's very helpful to care for the entire person, their emotional and physical and spiritual well-being, just like Jesus did. Jesus used sensory learning, and we're going to be talking a lot about sensory learning. Sensory learning, he used the environment when he was teaching. When the disciples were hungry and they were picking wheat out of the fields, he used this opportunity to teach. He used the rocks and the water and the bread and the wine, all of these different sensory aspects he used to teach us. Jesus incorporated movement into his teaching. Jesus was rarely in the synagogue teaching from what we see in the Bible. He was often walking down a path, trying to get somewhere, in a boat. So I love the verse, Deuteronomy 6:6-7. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Jesus made his teaching be a part of regular everyday life.